It is late, and the world outside has finally stopped its spinning for a while. The traffic has thinned out. The last few televisions are off. Somewhere down the hall, a refrigerator hums to itself, a low and steady companion to the dark. And here you are, wrapped in a blanket or stretched out flat, with all the day's noise slowly draining away. The way bath water drains from a tub, leaving only the quiet ring of porcelain and the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing. That is exactly where we want to be tonight. Not here exactly, but somewhere else. Somewhere far away and very long ago. I want to take you to a place where the air is thick with warmth, where the rain falls like a curtain being slowly drawn across the sky, where stone temples rise out of the jungle, and the water, believe it or not, is the real hero of the story. Tonight, we are going to talk about Angkor. Not the temples, not the carved faces, not the tourists, or the postcards, or the great dramatic ruins that sprawl across the Cambodian countryside. No, tonight we are going to talk about something quieter, something that is mostly invisible now. And yet, it is the very thing that made all those temples possible. We are going to talk about water, and the people who made sure it was always there. This is a sleepy story, so there will be no loud headlines here. No urgent warnings. No plot twists, the way a thriller might have them. This is a story about ordinary human hands and what they built together. It is about a civilization that understood something deeply, that water is not just something that falls from the sky and runs away. Water is something that can be held and shaped and shared. Water is a promise. And at the very heart of that promise were the reservoir workers, the diggers, the haulers, the ones whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose songs are long gone on the wind. And yet, without them, the whole glorious pyramid of kings and priests and battles and carving collapses into a heap of dry dust. So settle in. Pull the blanket up to your chin. If you have a pet nearby, let them curl up at your feet. Let your eyes get heavy, and let us drift slowly, gently, like a leaf on a canal, from this quiet room in your home all the way across the ocean, across the years, to the flooded plains of Southeast Asia, where an empire learned to dance with the monsoon. Let us begin under the rain. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of rain, not the sharp, nervous rapping of a winter storm against a windowpane, not the thin hiss of a summer drizzle. This is a different kind of rain. This is monsoon rain. It is not a shower. It is a presence, a great warm weight that lowers itself from the sky in that particular way that seems to turn the world soft. Each droplet is heavy and full-bodied, and they do not so much fall as they arrive. They land on the broad green leaves of banana plants and run off in silver rivulets. They drum on the palm thatch of a modest roof like 1,000 small fingers patting the skin of the world. And they keep coming, day after day, week after week, until the whole idea of a dry day seems like a myth. A story your grandfather tells that you half believe and half suspect is made up to comfort the children. It is during this long, wet season that we find the early Khmer people, long before Angkor became a name that anybody knew. They lived along the rivers, along the great lake that the Cambodians call Tonlé Sap, which swells like a living beast when the monsoon pushes the mighty Mekong River backwards, so that the lake itself turns around and becomes a floodplain, filling the low fields so that fish swim among the roots of trees where birds nested in the dry season. It is a strange and wonderful world built on this folding and unfolding of water. But the Khmer people noticed something. They were farmers, and farmers are the great observers of the world. They watch the sky the way sailors watch the sea. They see patterns. They test ideas. They understand that the ground remembers the rain long after the clouds have cleared. And in this land of plenty, there were two faces to the water everywhere. When the rains came, there was too much of it. The rivers rose. The fields became a brown and green mirror of God, and whole crops could be drowned in a single week. And then, just as reliably, the rains would stop. Months of golden, dry weather would follow, when the sky turned the color of old bone, when the earth cracked into 1,000 thirsty pieces, and the water that had seemed so abundant had vanished like a dream. Two extremes. Too much, then not enough. It is a cruel rhythm if you let it be. But the Khmer did not let it be. What if you could keep the water? Not just the water in little clay jars by the door, but the whole water, the whole river of the sky, the whole great flood. What if you could hold it somewhere, and then bring it out later, when the world was parched and desperate? That is the seed of the idea. And it is a very old idea indeed. But what the Khmer did with that idea over the centuries was something on an enormous, almost unimaginable scale. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the region was beginning to come together into a single, powerful kingdom. The center of this kingdom, the place where it lived and breathed and grew, was a great plain, flat as a dinner plate, ringed by low hills to the north, and drained by waterways that all headed, eventually, toward the Great Lake. It was here that a long procession of kings decided to build their capital. And a capital for a king is not just a place to live. It is the center of the universe. It must be grand, yes, but it must also be working. It must be a machine that feeds the people, and a machine that calms the fears of the people. And in this land, the machine ran on water. The first great reservoirs, the ones that would become the enormous barrays that you can still see from the air today, must have seemed like vanity projects, or perhaps like a kind of madness. Imagine standing on a piece of flat land, holding only a digging stick and a basket, and trying to imagine what it would take to build a lake. Not a pond, not a creek, a lake. A body of water so large that it would stretch farther than a person could walk in a morning. A lake that you could sail across. A lake that would hold enough water to feed an entire city for the whole dry season. And that is exactly what they built. Let us slow down and think about the labor of it, because the labor is the true subject of our story. Our histories are often written by the people who stood on top and gave the orders. The kings have their memorial stones, their inscriptions, their long lists of conquests and genealogies. The priests have their scrolls and their carvings. But the workers, the thousands and thousands of ordinary hands, they are mostly silent in the record. And yet, they are everywhere in the physical world. They are in the stones you touch when you visit Angkor today. They are in the depth of the water, or in the dry bowl of it, carved out of the earth. How did the reservoir workers even begin? The first step was the measuring. In the dry season before the rains, when the land was hard and clear, a team of engineers would walk out across the plain. They would have had ropes and long poles. They would have used the sun and the stars to find their lines. They were not using the kind of instruments we think of when we think of grand engineering. No theodolites, no laser levels. But they understood the way of the land, the gentle slope of it, the direction of the flow. They knew that water will always find the low ground, and so they would not fight the low ground. They would use it. They would mark out a rectangle, enormous in its proportions. In a later period, the Great West Barrier would stretch some 8 kilometers in one direction and over 2 kilometers in the other. 8 kilometers. To walk from one end to the other, carrying a basket of dirt on your back, would take the better part of the morning, and then you would have to turn around and walk back. That is the kind of scale we are talking about. A rectangle of land chosen to be the site of a human-made sea. Inside that rectangle, the workers began to dig, but not the whole rectangle at once. They dug channels, ditches that would become the retaining walls, the embankments that held the water in. And here is the beautiful part, the part that reveals how clever they were. They did not haul the dirt away. They heaped it up right there into the berms, the long raised banks. The digging and the building were the same act. Every basket of soil that came out of the center of the future lake became a part of the wall that held the lake in place. The workers were moving the earth only a very short distance, but they were moving a mountain of it, one basket at a time. Let me paint you a picture of a single day, a single worker in the middle of this great undertaking. Let us call him, perhaps, a man with a shoulder wound, or a man with a kind face, or just a man, because his name is lost to us. And any name we give him is a fiction that honors him anyway. He wakes before dawn in the cool of the morning, when the sky is gray and the birds are still talking themselves into the business of the day. He sleeps in a simple dwelling, a wooden frame with a woven mat wall, a roof of palm thatch, a floor raised above the ground for coolness, and to keep the insects and the snakes from sharing his blanket. He is not a slave, or at least not in the way we imagine slavery in the ancient world. He owes his labor, though, to the king. He owes his time, his sweat, his strength, because that is how the world works. The state is not an abstraction. The state is the king, and the king is the one who keeps the cosmos in order, and the cosmos requires water, and the water requires the king's wisdom, and the king's wisdom requires the labor of his people. It is a circle, and our worker is part of the circle. He is not asked if he wants to be in it. He is simply in it, the way a bird is in the air. He walks to the work site and joins a long line of other men and women. Yes, the women were there too. The old records and the bas-reliefs show us the labor of the community, and it is a community that includes everyone. The women carried baskets of earth, carried water for the workers, wove the mats, and made the food. They were not spectators to this great undertaking. They were the muscles and the rhythm of it. Our worker picks up his basket. It is a sturdy thing, woven from bamboo, with straps that loop over his head and rest across his forehead, leaving the strong muscles of his back and shoulders to do the heavy work. He stoops, he gathers a load of heavy soil, and he rises. The strap digs into his brow. He starts to walk. The sun is up now, and it is already warm on the back of his neck. He walks to the growing embankment. He climbs a rough ramp of packed earth, and he dumps the soil. Then he returns for another basket, and another, and another. The numbers are hard to grasp. We know that the West Barre, which was likely expanded and completed to its full form around the 11th century, encloses an area that holds something like 50 million cubic meters of water when it is full. And to create that bowl, to raise those walls, the workers moved an estimated several million cubic meters of earth. Let us pause on that number. Several million cubic meters. Imagine 100,000 trucks, each one loaded to the top with dirt. And then imagine that all those trucks are replaced by human beings with baskets. There were not trucks. There were not wheelbarrows or draft animals pulling carts carrying the soil. It was just the patient, repetitive, astonishing labor of people who could not possibly see the end of their task, because the end was beyond the horizon of their own lives. And yet, the work got done. We have to think about the rhythm of it, because a task like this is not sustained by passion or heroism. It is sustained by practice. The worker's mind, over the long hours, would enter a kind of trance. The body carries the rhythm, the footfall, the stoop, the lift, the stride, the release at the top of the embankment, the creak of the bamboo, the low murmurs of the other workers, the occasional call of a bird. The mind does not need to be working very hard. It can wander. It can tell itself stories. It can think about the small children at home, the taste of the rice porridge from breakfast, the dream from last night that fades in the heat of the morning. It can think about nothing at all. And this is where I want to gently point out the difference between our modern way of thinking and the slow way of the ancient world. We look at this and we think, what a monumental task. We think of efficiency, of timelines, of budgets. We think of how to get it done quickly, because time is money, as if time were a coin you could spend and then lose. But for the ancient workers, time was not a coin. The task was not a project with a deadline. It was just the shape of life. The reservoir would be built when it was built. The season would turn when it turned. The rain would come when it came. There was no great anxiety about finishing. There was only the doing of the thing, day by day, year by year, generation by generation. And this is why the reservoirs were not built in a single heroic push. They were enlarged. They were deepened. They were extended. The Great West Barre appears to have been created in stages, growing over centuries from a smaller system of canals. The workers who dug the first channel had no idea that eventually their grandchildren's grandchildren would be standing in the same spot, looking across a lake that seemed as wide as the world. is how great things are built, not in a single day, but in the steady addition of many days, many baskets, many footsteps. So, how did the reservoir work once it was full of water? Let us think about the mechanics of it, because it is elegant, and the elegance is part of the soothing nature of this story. The reservoir is a giant basin with an inlet and an outlet. During the rainy season, the water flows into the basin from a river or a canal system that has been carefully diverted. The basin fills slowly over many weeks until the great flat surface of the water reflects the sky like a mirror, the color of old silver. Then the rains stop and the dry season begins. This is the moment when the reservoir earns its keep. The outlet is opened gently, or perhaps the water is allowed to seep through the embankment in a controlled way that the engineers have designed. The water flows out into a network of canals, smaller and smaller, like the branching veins of a leaf. These canals carry the water to the rice fields, and the rice grows even in the dry weather because the water is still there, held in reserve from the months of rain. This is also how the city itself, the capital, stayed hydrated. The temples, the great stone buildings, they are not actually places where people lived. They are the homes of the gods, the centers of ritual. But around them, spread out across the plain, were the dwellings of the ordinary people, made of wood and thatch, and they did not last. They rotted and faded and returned to the soil, which is why the archaeological record is so skewed toward the stone and the water. The people lived in the space between the temples, and they needed water to drink, to cook, to wash, to water their gardens, for their buffalo and their cattle. The canals brought water closer to their homes, so that no woman had to walk hours to fill a jar for her family. And beyond the practical, there was something else. Water, in Khmer culture, as in so many cultures, was sacred. It was connected to the idea of purification, of abundance, of the fertility of the land. The reservoirs were not just public works. They were cosmic symbols. The great barrays, some scholars believe, were intended to represent the oceans that surrounded Mount Meru, the mythical center of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. The Temple Mountain, the central shrine, stood in the middle, surrounded by the waters of the cosmos. So when the worker dug the reservoir, he was not just making a water tank. He was making the universe. He was making the world safe, not just for rice, but for order itself. Let me tell you about one of the most beautiful of these water temples, and it is not a vast barray at all. It is a smaller structure called Nikpin, which means the entwined serpents. In the middle of a great reservoir, there is a small island, and on that island, there is a little tower with a face on each side, and around the base of the tower, a carved stone serpent coils, its heads stretching out. But the most remarkable part is the way water flows from this central spring, fountain, though it was, through 4 channels, each one leading to a pool in a different direction. The water in these pools was believed to have healing properties. Pilgrims would come, perhaps bathe in the water, make offerings, and hope to be cleansed of their illnesses. And who built this place? Workers, the same diggers, the same earth movers. They are the ones who created the island, who dug the basins, who shaped the stone to allow the water to flow in its gentle, sacred way. We see the face of a god on the tower, and we think the god is the point. But the hand of the worker is everywhere, in the careful level of the pool, in the precise channel. Their craft is the form that allows the god to be present. As the centuries passed, the empire grew, and the system grew with it. The great Angkor Wat itself, the most famous temple of all, was completed in the 12th century. It is surrounded by a wide moat, a rectangular ring of water that mirrors the sky and protects the sacred ground. And that moat is part of the same system. It was filled from the same sources, managed by the same channels, kept alive by the same laborers. When you look at Angkor Wat from the causeway crossing the moat on a calm morning, and you see the perfect reflection of 5 towers in the water, you are seeing the work of the reservoir keepers. The water is not decoration. It is the pulse of the whole complex. But even great systems wear out. And here is where our story takes a quieter, more melancholic turn. One of the great scholarly debates about Angkor is why the civilization declined. There are many theories, and they are not mutually exclusive. Wars, changes in trade routes, the coming of new religious ideas, and climate, all are part of the story. But one of the most striking theories is about the water itself. The system was so vast, so delicate, so dependent on careful maintenance, that it was fragile. If the workers stopped maintaining the canals, if the embankment silted up, if the monsoon failed for a decade, or if a long series of droughts was followed by massive flooding, the system would begin to unravel. And perhaps that is what happened in part. The very thing that made Angkor great, that gave it its abundance and its sacred power, was also its point of vulnerability. Because a lake is not a natural thing. It is a constant act of will, a holding action, a muscle that must be flexed continuously. The moment you stop digging, the moment you stop clearing, the moment you stop carrying the basket, the lake begins to decay. The weeds grow, the silt accumulates, the canals clog. The water finds its own way, which is often the wrong way from the perspective of the people who need it. The land becomes oversalted or overflooded. And so, slowly, the people did not disappear. They simply moved. They moved away from the great stones, from the massive reservoirs, to a region farther south, along the banks of the Mekong, where water was easier to manage. The capital city was abandoned. The jungle crept back in. The forest, with its long green fingers, reached out and pulled the temple stones into its embrace. The roots of strangler figs wrapped around the carved faces, slowly, patiently, with the same steadiness that the workers had once used to carry the earth. The great system fell quiet. The water stopped flowing in its channels. The reservoirs, those artificial lakes, filled in gradually, and some of them became natural marshes, homes to herons and lotus flowers, and the memory of the workers faded into the green. But here is the thing that keeps me up at night in the best possible way. The water is still there. The shape of the reservoirs is still there. Even from space, astronauts can see the faint outlines of the Great Barriers, the lines of the canals, the rectangle of the West Barrier, holding water even today, though it is not managed and maintained the way it once was. The land remembers what the workers did, and the descendants of those workers, the people of Cambodia today, they live in that landscape. They use some of the old canals. They fish in the old reservoirs. The water is still answering the questions that the ancient people asked, even if the ones who asked the questions are long gone. I want to pause here, in this quiet space, and think about the word that describes these workers. In modern language, we might call them engineers, or laborers, or civil servants. But in the old Khmer language, they might have been called by titles that mean something like the people of the work, or the people of the water. They were as much a part of the water system as the reservoir itself. The water did not fall into the barre on its own and stay where it should. It was guided, it was carried, and to guide it and carry it, you need intention. You need the human shoulder. You need the worn basket. You need the footpath worn smooth by thousands of bare feet. Let us sit with that for a moment, because it is a profound and peaceful thought. All of civilization is a kind of watering. We dig channels. We move the stuff of life from where it is abundant to where it is scarce. We build systems to hold the rain against the dry years. And we do it together in vast, coordinated efforts that are sometimes led by kings and sometimes by no one at all. The work is slow. The work is repetitive. The work is not glamorous. And yet it is the work that makes the great towers, the beautiful carvings, the golden dawns over the Temple Mount possible. Without the digger, there is no dreamer. Without the canal, there is no kingdom. Do you feel your eyes growing heavy? I hope so, because this is the kind of story that rewards the half-dream state, and the next parts of our journey will take us even deeper into the workings of the water. We have not yet talked about the way the engineers measured the levels, or how they built the sluices, the great gates that could hold back or release a river. We have not yet talked about the smaller, everyday uses of the canals, the washing and the playing, the children splashing in the shallows where the water runs clear. We have not yet talked about the songs of the workers, which are gone now, but which we can imagine, the call and response that kept the rhythm of the lifting and the moving, that made one basket and 1,000 baskets feel like part of a single heartbeat. But for now, we should slow down. Let the image of the great flat surface of the West Barrier rest in your mind, the water perfectly still, reflecting the pale blue of a late afternoon sky. Along the far edge, you can see the line of the embankment, rising several meters above the surrounding fields. It is covered in grass now, and there are a few low trees growing along the top. A couple of water buffalo wallow in the shallows near the edge, their dark hides glistening, their breath deep and unhurried. A heron stands in the water, absolutely still, watching. The workers have gone home. Their baskets have rotted. The sound of the digging has faded, absorbed into the air. But the water holds everything: the memory of the labor, the weight of the seasons, the silent greeting of a lake that was not born of nature, but was coaxed into being by the steady, loving, difficult work of human hands. And that is the feeling we are carrying with us tonight. That is the mood of our story. It is not about conquest. It is not about glory. It is about the quiet, persistent maintenance of life, the carrying of the basket, the opening of the gate, the gentle guidance of the water to fields that are thirsty and plants that are waiting for a drink. Soon, we will go deeper. We will look at the tools, the materials, the everyday routines of the reservoir worker. We might learn how they made the clay for the core of the embankment so that it would not leak. We might learn how they organized themselves, who gave the order to start a section of the canal, and how the food was distributed on a big project day. We will meet the engineers, the ones with the ropes and the stars, and we will see how they worked alongside the diggers, not above them. And we will gently, slowly, explore how this great machine, this water system, allowed a civilization to flourish for more than 600 years, and then why it faded. All of that is waiting for us, but not yet. Not this moment. This moment, the only task is rest. Let the sound of my voice wrap around you like a soft, warm current. Let it carry you along. Let the story of water and of the people who moved it, not with iron, not with machines, but with their own strong backs and patient minds, drift through your thoughts like a cloud moving across the face of the moon. You do not need to remember every detail. There is no quiz at the end. You can simply float here in the quiet of the night, with the rain drumming softly on the roof, or the wind moving through the trees outside your window. And you can feel a connection across the vast distance of time to that man with the basket, walking his long walk, carrying his weight, building a world he would never see complete. And maybe that is the most comforting part of all. The work does not need to be finished in one lifetime. The reservoir can grow, season by season, generation by generation. The water can be held, and the harvest can come, and the kingdom can be sustained. And, indeed, the kingdom was sustained for a very long time. The reservoirs filled, the canals ran, the rice fields turned a brilliant green across thousands of hectares, and then turned golden and were harvested, and the people ate, and the temples were built, and the stone faces smiled out over a prosperous, well-watered land. It is a nice image, a green land, a well-watered land, a land where no one had to go very far to find a drink. That is not a small thing. That is the foundation of everything else, of songs and dances, of poetry and prayer, of family and festival. And it was all made possible by the quiet ones, the ones who got up early in the morning, who put the strap on their forehead, who gripped the bamboo basket with both hands, and who walked and walked and walked as the water waited to be caught and the kingdom waited to be born. Now breathe. Let your chest rise and fall. Let the names and dates slip away, because they were never the real point anyway. The real point is the feel of the earth in your hands, the weight of the basket on your back, the small, sure knowledge that you are doing something that will outlast you even if you never see the end of it. And that is enough for tonight. That is enough to hold in your heart as you slip further toward sleep. The reservoir is calm. The workers have gone home. The water is still. Rest now. Rest now and dream of the water and the piece of a land that was held together, one basket at a time, by the hands of the faithful. In a little while, we will continue our wandering. We will step along the embankments. We will follow the canals to the fields, and we will learn the secrets of the sluices that controlled the flow of an empire. But for now, the story has softened, the night has deepened, and the water is waiting for no one. Close your eyes. Let your mind become a wide, flat, still lake reflecting the stars, held in place by the careful work of generations, and drift, and drift, and drift. You might think you have floated all the way out into that still lake, and perhaps you have. But I do not want you to go entirely quiet on me yet. There is still a little light in the sky, that pale, soft blue that lingers after the sun has gone down behind the trees. And there is still a little of the story left for us to walk through together. Not quickly, never quickly. We will walk the way the workers walked, one slow step after another. And if you find your eyes closing somewhere along the way, that will be just as it should be. Let us go back to the beginning of a morning. Not the noisy beginning, the one that happens in the gray hour before the birds, when the overseers light their burning sticks and poke the sleeping forms of the work crews with the blunt ends of their staffs. That is a true part of the story, too, and I will not pretend the waking was always gentle. But there is another beginning, a softer one, that comes a little later. It comes when the mist is lifting off the surface of the water and the first light reaches the top of the embankment. The shadow of the great wall is long and cool on the fields below, and the dew is still heavy on the grass. A heron walks with the slow dignity of a person who knows exactly where the little fish are hiding and is in no particular hurry about it. And along the top of the embankment, one figure appears, then another, then three more, perhaps in a line, each carrying a small cloth bundle and a clay pot of drinking water. Their footprints appear in the pale, damp soil, side by side, and then one set turns off to follow the inner slope down toward the edge of the water. You might not notice them if you were not looking. That is what they were accustomed to, I think, to be unseen, to arrive before the light fully arrived, and to leave after the light had gone, and to be remembered only in the smoothness of the paths, the wetness of the soil, and the fullness of the lake. Let us look at the tools they set down on the grass while they stretched and yawned and looked out across the water. There was the basket, of course. It is worth taking a long, slow look at the basket, because so much of this story rests upon it. The basket is made of split bamboo, roughly woven, with a rim that has been worn smooth and dark by the touch of 1,000 hands before yours. It is not a beautiful thing. It is not precious in the way of a carved door or a gold bracelet. It is the color of straw, stained here and there with the brown of dry earth and the green of crushed leaves. It has a small hole in the bottom that someone has patched with a scrap of palm leaf and a bit of resin. It will last another season if it is not dropped on a boulder or bitten through by the damp. And yet, if you were to hold that basket in your hands and turn it over, you would realize that it is the perfect shape for what it does. It is not too deep, because a basket that is too deep is hard to empty. It is not too shallow, because a basket that is too shallow does not carry enough. The rim fits against the forehead, or against the shoulder, or against the flat of the back, depending on the day and the need. The weave is open enough to let the water drain away when you're carrying wet mud, and firm enough to hold the finer soil without losing it all through the gaps. A good basket is a quiet kind of genius. Nobody dusts it off and shows it to visitors. But the whole kingdom was built out of the shape of it, the way a nest is built out of the shape of a beak. Beside the basket, there is the carrying pole. It is a length of seasoned wood, about as long as a person is tall, worn smooth, in the middle where it rests on the shoulder. The baskets hang from the two ends, and the pole bends slightly with the weight, giving a little spring to each step. If you have ever carried water from a well with a pole, you know that the trick is not to hold it stiff, but to let it ride, to let it swing, to walk in time with the bounce of it. The workers of the barre must have known this very well. They walked to the dig, and they walked back, and the pole, in its small way, was their companion. It creaked in rhythm. It lifted half their burdens. It asked nothing in return except to be carried, and carried, and carried, until the wood wore thin and someone made a new one. There was also the hoe, or what we might call a hoe, though it was not quite like the ones in a garden shed today. The blade was a strip of iron or bronze, lashed to a handle of hardwood. It was not heavy. It did not need to be. The soil of the floodplain is not baked brick. It is a soft, generous earth, full of the memory of old rivers. A worker could loosen it with a few sharp taps, then bend and scoop the loose earth into the basket with bare hands. We should not imagine them being cruel to the earth. The earth was their mother, their mattress, their rice field. They worked it with a kind of intimacy, the way a potter works clay. And when the iron grew dull, a traveling smith would come along the embankment with his little fire and his tiny hammer, and the blade would be heated and struck and cooled and made sharp again. That was a small, cheerful event. People gathered around the edge of the fire. Someone told a joke. Someone else passed around a jar of water. The blade was in no hurry, and neither were they. Now, how did they all arrange themselves on a working day? This is a question that has no single answer, because the work was not always the same. On some days, there were thousands of people along the embankment, and the sound of the digging was like the sound of rain on a stone roof, a low, continuous patter. On other days, there were only a few dozen, doing the quieter work of patching and smoothing, filling the little gullies the rain had carved, pressing the earth back into place with their feet. But when the great effort was underway, the work was divided the way a piece of cloth is divided into threads. There were the diggers, bent low, loosening the earth. There were the basket carriers, walking in a line up the slope of the embankment, bent beneath their loads. There were the dumpers at the top, who swung the basket and let the earth fall, and watched it roll down the far side, and then brought the empty basket back down at a jog. And there were the Tampers, who followed behind with stone rammers, rising and falling, and rising and falling, patting the new earth down until it was as firm as a sleeping child's chest. It is not easy for us to imagine the numbers. We are used to machines that can move a mountain in a week, but the Khmer workers moved a mountain with their bodies over many years, and they did it without counting the cost in any way that would make sense to us. There were no punch cards. There were no time clocks. There were, we think, overseers, because every large project has someone who is in charge of the rhythm. We can picture him now, the overseer, walking along the top of the embankment with a short staff in his hand, not using it to strike anyone, just using it to point, to gesture, to mark the line where the next layer of earth should go. He carries a tally stick, a long sliver of bamboo on which he scratches small marks to count the basketfuls or the work shifts. He is not a cruel man. He is simply someone who remembers when he himself was a basket carrier, and who knows that a day of good work leaves a person tired in the shoulders and peaceable in the mind. We know very little about him, this overseer, because the inscriptions of Angkor do not often mention such people by name. They are part of what scholars call the workforce, as if they were one single, smooth thing. But he was not smooth. He had a favorite kind of rice. He had a scar on his knee from a fall on a wet slope. He had a wife who brought him his midday meal in a covered bowl, and who sometimes lingered a little longer than she needed to, just to stand beside him in the cool of the shade. None of that is in any inscription, and yet we can hold it in our hearts, because it is true of all people who work with their hands in any century. The overseer was a man. The digger was a woman. The children who carried the smallest baskets were children, who laughed and dropped things and ran after each other when the overseer was looking the other way. Perhaps we should spend a little time with the food, since the food is such a comforting part of any long day. On a large project day, the kitchens were set up near the foot of the embankment, under a lean-to of palm leaves. There were great clay pots, as big as washtubs, full of rice steaming over slow fires. There were dried fish, soaked and grilled on sticks. There were greens gathered from the edges of the fields, and there was sometimes a soup made of whatever the river had offered that morning. When the midday bell rang, or the overseer shouted, the workers set down their baskets and their poles and their hoes, and they walked in a long, slow stream toward the smell of the smoke. They sat on their heels in the shade, or on the trunks of fallen trees, and they ate. They did not speak much, because they were hungry. But there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in that silence, a contentment that comes from having worked hard and eaten well, and being surrounded by people you know. I like to think about the cook, an older man or woman whose face was brown and creased from the firelight and the years. They had a wooden ladle as big as a paddle, and they would not let anyone dip their own bowl into the pot, because that was how the soup went bad. You held out your bowl, and you waited, and the ladle came down slowly, and when it lifted, your bowl was full. That is a small thing, but it is a good thing to remember just before sleep. It reminds us that civilization is not just water and stone. It is also the waiting, the patience, the hand that gives, and the hand that receives. Now, about the making of the embankment itself. This is where the engineering gets interesting, though we will not let it get too academic. The barre needed to hold water. A simple pile of dirt would not do, because water is patient and clever, and it will always find the little gap, the weak place, the spot where a root has grown and rotted and left a hollow. So the workers built the embankment in layers, and the layers were not all the same. At the bottom, there was a core of clay, a thick, fine clay that water cannot easily pass. They dug this clay from the bed of the reservoir itself, from the deepest parts where the soil was fine and gray and smooth. They carried it up and laid it down in layers, and then they pounded it. This pounding was not a gentle patting. It was the work of the tampers, and there were many of them standing in rows, lifting their stone weights and letting them fall. The sound was a great, soft thump, 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 like a giant's heart beating far below the earth. It is a wonder that it did not put them all to sleep. On top of the clay core, there were layers of sand and gravel and ordinary earth. We might think of the embankment as a sandwich, if we want a comfortable image. The clay is the soft, dense middle that holds the water. The sand and gravel are the crisp outer layers that let the weight drain and settle. And on the very top, the workers planted grass. This is a detail I love, because it shows a kind of thoughtfulness that is easy to miss. The grass was not for beauty, though it was beautiful. It was for the rain. Rain falling on bare earth will carve channels, and channels will grow into gullies, and gullies can eat through an embankment in a single bad season. But grass holds the earth with its long, fine fingers. Grass keeps the rain where it falls and lets it sink in slowly. So the workers did not just build a wall, they gave it a skin, a living skin of green that would hold the whole thing together for decades, whether they were there to watch it or not. That is the kind of wisdom that comes from people who know that the work will outlive them. Sometimes, when the light in the sky is exactly right, you can stand at the top of the West Barre today and look down its long, gentle slope, and you can see the lines of the old construction, the subtle difference in the color of the earth where one layer was laid upon another. It looks like a painting that has been overpainted many times, each brushstroke a season, a generation, a basket of clay. And if you let your eyes go soft, you can almost see the workers there, not as ghosts, but as a kind of memory that the earth itself has kept. They are bent over, they are lifting, they are carrying, they are tamping, and they are doing it all in the warm, patient rhythm that is the real heartbeat of this story. But let us not forget the engineers. They are the ones who knew where the embankment should go, because they had the ropes and the stars. We spoke of them earlier, and now it is time to meet them properly, if only in our imagination. The engineer was not a person in a clean robe standing on a hill with a scroll. He was a man who walked the land with a length of rope, a rope with knots tied in it at regular intervals. He and his assistants would stretch this rope along the ground, pull it tight, and mark the line. The knots were not exactly our meters and centimeters, but they were close enough. They were based on the length of a stride, or the span of 2 arms, or the width of a hand. And because the rope could stretch in the heat and shrink in the rain, the engineer was always adjusting, always going back to the beginning, always looking up at the sky to remind himself of the true direction. How did they find the true direction? This is one of the loveliest secrets of the old builders. They used the sun. They used a stick. They used a shadow. In the morning, the engineer would plant a stick in the ground and mark the end of its shadow. In the afternoon, he would mark the end of the shadow again. And the line between the 2 marks was the east-west line, and the line perpendicular to it was north-south. That is all. That is the entire secret of the orientation of the reservoirs and the temples of Angkor, the thing that makes the stone faces turn exactly toward the dawn on the equinox. It is a stick and a shadow and a patient eye. We can think of this as we drift toward sleep, and it will not trouble us. It is a simple, true thing, and simple, true things are the best things to hold on to. The engineer also looked at the stars, but perhaps not in the way we might imagine. He was not trying to chart the heavens. He was trying to find the North Star and the great turning wheel of the sky, and the time of night when the water in the measuring basin was most still. The measuring basin, by the way, was a simple thing, a flat stone with a small hole in it, or a clay dish with a mark on the inside. The engineer filled it with water and waited. When the water was perfectly level, he used it to sight the line of the embankment so that the top would be level from one end to the other. Water finds its own level, and so the engineer trusted water to teach him. That is a good image for a sleepy story. The water was not only the thing being built, it was also the thing doing the building. It was the teacher. It was the level. It was the mirror in which the engineer saw the true shape of the land. There is a gentle humor in the thought of the engineer's apprentice. Every great engineer has an apprentice, usually a young man who is not yet old enough to have grown a proper chin strap of a beard. The apprentice holds the stick. He runs the errands. He carries the jar of water. And sometimes, when the engineer is looking up at the sky too long, the apprentice will be looking at a water buffalo on the far bank, and the stick will sink into the mud, and the engineer will turn and say something in a tone that carries across the water. No, we will not pretend the tone was always kind, but the apprentice learned. He learned to stand very still. He learned to watch the shadow edgewise so that he could see the moment it touched the mark. And years later, when he was the engineer, he would have his own apprentice, and he would tell him to stand very still, and he would look at the sky, and then he would look down, and he would see the shadow, and the world would hold its breath for a moment, and the work would go on. Now we come to the sluice gates, and here we may perhaps be reaching the most wonderful part of the whole story. A reservoir is a locked box. Water must get in, and water must get out, and the locks are the gates. The Khmer engineers built the sluices out of sandstone the same sandstone that was used for the temples. So deep in the heart of the embankment, hidden from view, there are blocks of stone fitted together so precisely that a knife blade cannot slide between them. The gate itself was a frame of stone, and the water passed through a channel in the middle of the frame. And in that channel there were grooves, and in the grooves there were wooden panels. These panels were the true lock and key of the kingdom. To open the gate, the workers lifted the panels, one, by means of a long lever or a rope. It was slow work. The wood was heavy, and after a few years in the damp, it was heavier still. But the workers knew the touch of each panel, the way a person knows a familiar door. They knew which panel stuck, and which one slid easily, and which one had to be tapped gently at the bottom with a wooden mallet before it would lift at all. When the last panel was raised, the water began to move. At first, it was just a murmur, a silver thread along the bottom of the channel. Then it grew, it pressed, it pushed. The channel filled, and the water poured out on the other side with a sound that is hard to describe, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. It is the sound of a held breath finally released. It is the sound of a thirsty field being remembered. The workers who opened the gate would lean on their levers and watch. They would not shout. There's something about the release of water that makes people quiet. It is a serious and beautiful thing. The water curls and twists and carries with it the small reflections of clouds and leaves and faces. It runs along the bottom of the canal, and the bottom of the canal is lined with stones, and the stones are worn smooth and green with the passing of many years. The workers might dip their hands in it. They might splash their faces. They might simply stand, letting the coolness come up off the moving water. And then, when the fields below had received enough, they would lower the panels again, one by one, and the water would slow, and the murmur would quiet, and the gate would be closed, and the barre would go back to being a still expanse, waiting for the next command. The children, of course, had a different relationship with the sluice. When the gate was open and the water was flowing, the children would gather downstream, where the canal widened and became shallow. They would wade in. They would paddle. They would chase the silver minnows that were carried along with the water, and they would laugh when the minnows slipped between their fingers. Their mothers and fathers would pretend to be annoyed, but they were not really annoyed. There is a particular kind of joy that comes from the sound of children playing in water, and it is the same joy in every land and every century. It is the joy of life that does not yet know it is part of a great system. It is the joy that forgets the basket and the rope and the tamping and the clay. For a few hours, the water is not a public utility. It is a place to splash, a place to cool your feet, a place where the whole sky sits in a puddle, and the whole world is only as big as your cupped hands. We should also imagine the fishermen. The barre was not only for irrigation. It was also a kind of fish farm, managed by nature and shared by the people of the surrounding villages. Families would come to the edge of the water in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the surface of the lake was a sheet of hammered brass. They would set their nets, throw them wide, and draw them in slowly. The fish in the barre were fat and shining, the color of the water itself. The work of drawing the net was a slow, collective dance, a pulling and releasing and stepping, with the wet rope slipping through the hands. There was an old saying among the fishermen, something like, "The water keeps count of what it owes us, and it always pays the same." No, we do not know the exact saying, but we can lean back and imagine it being said by an old grandmother, seated on the bank with a half-woven net in her lap, and we can feel the sense in it. The songs of the workers are gone, as it was said, but we can still feel their shape. Work songs are not entertainment. They are a way of keeping time, of making 1,000 bodies move as one, so that the basket is lifted and emptied at exactly the same moment all along the line. The song would have a call and a response. The leader would sing, and the line would answer. The words were probably not the high words of poetry. They were the plain words of a hot day. They were about the heaviness of the basket, the coolness of the water a little farther on, the joke that someone told last night, the pretty girl from the rice field who walked by yesterday. But the tune was the important thing. The tune was the engine. And when the tune slowed, the work slowed. And when the tune quickened, the work quickened. We cannot record the tune now. It has long ago dissolved into the air. But if you listen very carefully in the half-dark of your own room, between one breath and the next, you may almost hear it. It is the tune of every working day, in every age, the tune that says, "We will do this. We will do this together. We will do this until it is done." Now, the maintenance of such a system was a never-ending task. We do not always like to talk about maintenance, because it is not a glamorous subject, but it is the true subject of this story. The barre did not take care of itself. After every monsoon, the gate channels had to be checked, because a tree branch could lodge in the groove and make the panels stick fast. The embankment had to be walked all the way around so that the workers could look for the small, dark spots where water was seeping through. A seep was not a disaster. It was a warning. It was a place where the earth was whispering, and if you listened, you could repair it before it became a shout. So a worker would walk the top of the embankment in the early morning, after the first heavy rains of the season, and they would walk slowly, with their eyes fixed on the slope below them. They would be looking for the small glint of wetness, the tiny mound of fresh mud that meant the water was finding a way out. And when they found it, they would not panic. They would call for a basket of the fine clay and a couple of companions, and they would kneel down and press the clay into the spot with their hands, and smooth it and tamp it, and then sit back and watch it. It was patient work. It was humble work. But it was the work that kept the kingdom alive. There's a small, quiet joke I would like to share with you, and it is this. The crab, when the workers were patching the leaks in the embankment, they would sometimes find that the leak had been caused by a crab, a small freshwater crab that had dug its way through the soil. The crab, of course, was not trying to destroy the kingdom. It was just making a home. And the worker, of course, was not angry with the crab. The worker would lift the crab carefully out of the hole, set it down on the ground, and watch it scuttle away sideways into the grass. Then they would fill the hole. And then, sometimes, they would have to come back the next week and do it again, because the crab had returned, or another crab. And this time, perhaps, the worker would speak to the crab, gently and sternly at the same time, the way you might speak to a child who has wandered too close to the fire. We do not know if the crab listened, but the image of that conversation, the worker and the crab, standing at the foot of the great embankment, discussing the boundary between a home and a kingdom, is a very peaceful image, and a very old one. It is the image of living with the world, not conquering it. In the dry season, the work of the reservoir took on a different rhythm. The rains had stopped. The water level was falling slowly, and the great flat bed of the barre was beginning to show at the edges. The workers would walk out onto the exposed mud, where the cracked earth made 1,000 small, dry mosaics, and they would repair what they could. They would cut the grass on the top of the embankment so that the roots would grow deep and thick. They would repaint the wooden panels of the gates with a thin oil to keep them from drying out and shrinking. And at night, under the moon, the gatekeepers would sometimes open the little sluice that fed the villages, not for the fields, but for the domestic water of the houses. The water would whisper out into the night, and the people would come with their pots and their jars, walking in the cool, carrying the moonlight down to the kitchen. And the barre, in that way, was a kind of moon, pouring itself into 1,000 smaller bowls. We should not imagine that everything was always peaceful. There were dry years, and there were arguments, and there were times when the water was low and the voices were raised. But even those moments are part of the quiet story, because they were settled, as these things must be settled, not with war, but with waiting and working and the slow turning of the seasons. The people of Angkor lived close enough to the land to understand that the rain would return. The rain had always returned, and so, when the water was scarce, they did not despair. They tightened their belts. They spoke to their neighbors. They shared what they had. They opened the gate at dawn instead of at dusk, so that the fields downstream could have their turn first. It is easy to love a kingdom in its golden light. It is harder, but more human, to love it in the dimness of a dry season, with the cracked earth underfoot, and the sun high, and the water still a whisper in the distance. And then the monsoon would come. It would begin with the wind, a warm wind that smelled of wet earth and distant rain. And then the first drops would fall, big and soft, tapping on the roofs and the stones and the leaves. The workers would look up from their baskets and laugh. They would hold out their hands. They would open their mouths to catch the first sweet drops. And then the rain would come down in earnest, a great gray curtain, a solid wall of water, and the whole land would turn green almost overnight. The barre would begin to fill. The level would rise, slowly at first, then faster. The gate channels would sing. The mud would become soft and soft and softer, until the hose sank in easily and the baskets lifted full and dripping. The children would run out into the rain, and the mothers would call them in, and the fathers would stand at the edge of the embankment, leaning on their tools, watching the world being remade. Years passed, decades passed, generations passed, and the water did not forget. The Barre was a constant, the way the sky is a constant, the way the seasons are a constant. And as the water held steady, the kingdom grew strong. Rice was planted in the fields, and the rice grew tall, and the harvest was good, and the temples rose, and the carvings were finished, and the kings looked out over their well-watered land and gave thanks. And the workers, the diggers, the basket carriers, the tampers, the gatekeepers, the fishermen, and the children splashing in the shallows were the ones who made it possible. They were the body of the water system. They were the current under the surface. They were the work that the stones were proud of, even if the stones never said so. And then, very slowly, as all things change, the great system began to loosen its hold on the land. It was not a sudden thing. It was not a disaster in a single season. It was a loosening, a slackening, the way a shawl slips slowly from the shoulders of a person who has grown tired. There were many reasons, and we do not need to name them all tonight. The rains became less reliable. The great channels silted up slowly with each year's load, and the effort to clear them grew harder. The ships still came and went, but the roads changed, and the trade changed, and the people began to move, a few families here, a few there, settling closer to the great river and the great lake where the water was easier to meet. The temples stayed, the stones stayed, the carvings stayed, but the water system, the vast, breathing, faithful water system, was maintained by fewer and fewer hands, and then by none at all, and the seasons took it back. It is a soft thing to say, but I will say it. The water did not leave. It found other places to go. The gates rotted. The clay core softened. The grass grew over the embankments, and the trees followed, and the barres became dry plains or shallow pools, depending on the year. The great stone faces of the temple towers looked out over the returning forest, and the snakes returned, and the birds returned, and the silence returned. It is not a sad ending if we can hold it gently. It is, in its own way, a kind of rest. All that labor, all that carrying, all that digging and tamping and patching and checking and opening and closing of gates did what it was meant to do. It held the land for 600 years, and then it let the land go. And the land, which had been loved and watered and fed for all that time, did not hold a grudge. It simply became green again. But the work was not wasted. Nothing that is carried with love is wasted. The shape of the land still follows the lines of the old channels. The rice fields, even today, catch the water where the water was once guided. The villages sit on the high ground where the old embankments made the land firm. The children still splash in the shallows of the Barre, and the heron still stands at the edge, and the water buffaloes still wallow. And the sound of the water, when the gate is opened at dawn, is still the sound of a held breath released. The workers are gone. Their names are gone. Their songs are gone. But the water remains, and the memory of the water remains, and that memory is not a ghost. It is a calm, a deep, a still place inside the history of the world, like the reflection of a cloud in a wide, flat lake. And so we can rest here, at this point in our story. We have walked the embankment, and we have watched the baskets fill, and we have listened to the tampers, and we have stood beside the sluice gate in the early morning, with the cold water curling about our ankles, and the whole day spread out before us like a sheet of pale silk. There is still more to know if we want to know it. We could talk about the smaller reservoirs, the channel that linked one temple to the next, the way the monks used the water in their rituals, the way the kings used it in their dreams of heaven on earth. We could talk about all of that, and perhaps we will in a little while. But the night is at the stage when the edges of things begin to soften, when the room grows dim and the shoulders grow warm, and the mind begins to roll gently, like a child turning over in its sleep. Let us leave the workers there for now. Let them rest beside the water, with their baskets at their feet and their poles across their knees. Let the overseer walk one more time along the top of the embankment, looking out at the sunset, counting in his head the days until the rain. Let the cook stir the pot one last time and cover it with a leaf. Let the children come dripping out of the canal, their wet footprints drying in the warm evening air. And let the water rise slowly, imperceptibly, in the stillness of the falling dark. There is a gate, and there is a handle, and there is the sound of a latch. But we will leave it closed for now. We will leave it closed, and we will let the water keep its secret a little longer. I will be here when you wake, or when you half wake, and the story will be here, curled up beside me like a sleeping cat, patient and warm and faithful. The kingdom is gone. The workers are gone. The songs are gone. But the water remembers, and the water will tell us the rest, whenever we are ready, in the deep hush of the night, with the stars turning above the old embankment, and the earth still holding the mark of every footstep. And yet, the water never really stopped moving, even after we closed the gate and turned away. It slipped into the smaller channels as easily as a thought slips into a dream, and it carried on its quiet journey toward the temples. And if you are still with me, still floating just beneath the surface of sleep, I would like to take your hand the way the overseer once took the hand of his young son, and walk with you along one of those smaller channels, through the reeds, past the lotus leaves, toward the wide and silent moat that surrounds the great temple of Angkor Wat. The moat was not simply a decoration, though it certainly was beautiful. It was a piece of the same vast waterwork, connected to the same pulse that filled the barrays and fed the rice fields. When the rain came and the great reservoir rose, the water was let through a series of small gates and culverts, each one no larger than a doorway, and it wandered through the flat land in channels that were easy to miss if you did not know what to look for. A traveler crossing the plain might have thought it was just a stream, a natural finger of the lake reaching inland. But the stream had been dug, and the bank had been shaped, and the clay at the bottom had been tamped flat by the same patient feet that had built everything else. There is nothing in this world that was made by those workers that was not made with purpose. Even the smallest trickle had a name and a job and a place in the long order of the water. Let us follow one of those trickles now. Let us picture it as a thread of silver running through the green, On either side, the grass grows thick, and the buffalo stand in the shallows, chewing slowly, watching us with their patient dark eyes. The water is cool and clear, and it makes a soft sound as it moves, a sound like a whisper in a crowded room, a sound that does not demand attention, but is always there underneath. If we walked far enough, and if the year was kind, we would come at last to the great moat, and we would see the temple rising out of the center like a mountain made of stone and cloud. The towers are shaped like lotus buds. The galleries stretch out along the horizon, and the water, the wide, still water of the moat, holds all of it in its mirror, and the world doubles, and the sky meets the lake, and it is easy to believe that the temple was not built on the earth at all, but was lowered gently from above, and that the water was always there, waiting to receive it. The workers who built that temple had to dig the moat with the same hands that carried the stone. Think of that, if you can, before you sleep. Think of the line of basket carriers moving out of the pit, each one stepping carefully, each one turning, each one walking the short path to the growing mound of earth. Their feet made the path smooth. Their shoulders wore a groove in the wood of the carrying poles. And in the evening, when the shadow of the temple mound stretched across the water, and the light turned gold, and then rose, and then violet, they would set down their baskets and sit on the edge of the moat and dangle their legs over the dark water. They did not know that their work would be called a wonder of the world. They did not know that 1,000 years later, people would fly across the oceans just to look at it. They knew only that the water was rising, and that the clay was moving, and that the king had asked for a great thing, and that the earth was giving it up a basket at a time. And there is a small, quiet miracle in that. The way a great thing is made of small things carried carefully. The way a mountain of stone begins as a single block, dragged on a sled of logs, with the ropes cutting into the shoulders of the men who pull. The way a moat begins as a line scratched in the dirt by the toe of a sandal. The line becomes a trench. The trench becomes a channel. The channel fills with water, and the water steadies, and the reflection grows. And before anyone has quite understood what has happened, the earth has been reshaped into something that looks as if it had always been there. That is the sign of good work, the old workers used to say, when the making leaves no trace of the maker. And so we do not know their names. We do not know their faces. We know only the shape of the land, and the coolness of the water against our ankles, and the feeling that we are standing on the edge of something that was loved into place. Now let us leave the great moat, if you do not mind, and walk the other way, back toward the living quarters of the temple complex, where the monks kept their own smaller pools. There is a stone stairway going down, and at the bottom there is a tank of water, perhaps 20 paces across, lined with laterite blocks that have grown soft and green with moss. The surface is covered with lotus leaves, and the flowers stand up tall and pink and white, and there is a wooden platform where the monks would come each morning before the sun was fully up. They would kneel at the edge of the water, and they would dip a bronze bowl into the pool, and the bowl would come up full and shining. And then they would pour the water back slowly in a thin stream, and the sound of the pouring would blend with the sound of the birds waking and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. They did this, I believe, because the water was not only a thing to be used, it was a thing to be honored. It was the living presence of the sky, falling as rain, gathered by the earth, held in the arms of the barre, and offered to the temple, and then offered back to the ground with a blessing. This is one of the gentle things we lose when we look at the old engineers only through the lens of numbers. We measure the capacity of the reservoir. We count the cubic meters of earth. We map the gradients of the channels. And all of that is good and true. And the engineers who study Angkor have done wonderful work in their careful, quiet way. But the water was also a gift, and the workers were its bearers. When the monks blessed the water, they were blessing the whole long chain of hands that had brought it from the sky to the stone. When the king poured a libation of sacred water over the linga in the deepest chamber of the temple, he was pouring the labor of 1,000 unnamed people, and the water was heavy with their sweat. That is not a bad thought to have late at night, when the world is dim and the mind is open. It is a thought that makes the workers into something more than numbers. It makes them into a kind of prayer, written in mud and clay and carried on the shoulders of the faithful. There is a story, and I cannot tell you if it is true, because all of these old stories are made of the same stuff as the water, which flows and changes and finds its own level. But there is a story about one of the kings of Angkor who became too proud. He looked out over his great reservoir, and he saw the water lying flat and still and obedient, and he thought, I have conquered the rain. I have put the sky in a bowl. And so he ordered the builders to make him a small island in the middle of the barre, with a temple on it, so that he could sit in the center of his triumph and feel the water all around him, cool and tame and distant. And the builders did as they were told, because that is what builders do. They built the island, and they built the temple, and the king rowed out in his boat and climbed the steps and sat in the shade and looked out over the water that he believed he owned. But one of the workers, an old woman who had spent her whole life carrying mud, stood at the edge of the shore and watched the king sail away, and she laughed. And when the younger workers asked her why she was laughing, she said, he believes he has conquered the water. But the water has never been conquered. It is only borrowed. It is only on loan from the clouds, and the clouds will take it back when they are ready. Every drop in that reservoir was once a rainstorm, and every rainstorm was once an ocean, and every ocean was once a tear in the eye of a god. The king is sitting on an island of mud in a puddle of borrowed time. And the water is patient, and the water will wait, and the water will remember. I like that story very much, whether it is true or not. I like the image of the old woman, with her mud-stained skirt and her worn basket, standing on the shore and laughing softly to herself as the royal boat grows smaller and smaller in the distance. She was not disrespectful. She was not angry. She was simply seeing clearly. She had touched the mud of that reservoir with her bare hands for so many years that she knew something the king did not know. She knew that the mud was alive, and that the water was alive, and that the whole vast machine of channels and gates and embankments was only a kind of hammock stretched between the sky and the soil. It was comfortable. It was well made, but it was not a prison for the rain. It was a resting place, a way station, a moment of coolness on a long journey from the clouds to the sea. And the water, when its time came, would go on its way, and the mud would settle, and the grass would grow, and the king's island would become a hill in the middle of a green plain. And the only thing that would remain would be the memory of the water, lying in the shape of the land, like a ghost in the earth. The kings of Angkor did not see it that way in the beginning. They saw the water as a source of power, and they were not wrong. A king who could feed his people in the dry season was a king who could command their love and their labor. A king who could make the rice fields green when the neighbors were starving was a king who had the gods on his side. And so they built their temple mountains, rising in great terraces out of the watery plain, and they surrounded them with moats that were meant to represent the oceans that girdle the world. When you looked at the temple from a distance, you were not just looking at a building. You were looking at Mount Meru, the center of the universe, floating on the cosmic ocean. The workers who built it were not just moving earth and stone. They were making the heavens visible. It is a heady thing to think about, and it is no wonder that the kings slept well at night, curled up in the certainty that they had built a ladder to the sky and put the ocean in a ring around it. But the workers, the diggers and the tampers and the basket carriers, did not sleep in palaces. They slept in huts along the embankments, and they woke when the roosters crowed, and they walked out into the wet dawn with their hoes over their shoulders. They did not dream of Mount Meru, or if they did, perhaps they dreamed of it in a simpler way. They dreamed of a mountain of corn that never grew empty. They dreamed of a river of palm sugar. They dreamed of a harvest so great that the granaries overflowed, and no child went to bed hungry. The heaven of the king was made of gold and stone. The heaven of the worker was made of rice and water. And both of them were real in their own ways, because both of them were built by the same hands. The temple and the rice field were not enemies. They were the two children of the same mother, and the mother was the water, and the water loved them both. There is a small reservoir near one of the later temples, a place called Nikpin, where the water was shaped into a great pool with 4 smaller pools around it, connected by carved stone spouts in the shape of the heads of lions and horses and elephants and men. The king would come here, and the sick would come here, and the monks would stand at the edge and recite the sacred words, and the water, it was said, would heal. Whether it truly healed, I do not know. Perhaps some of it was faith. Perhaps some of it was the simple medicine of bathing in clean, clear, moving water instead of the muddy, stagnant water of everyday life. But I know that the work of making that place was delicate work. The stone spouts had to be carved so that the water would flow through them smoothly, without backing up, without spilling over the edge. The canals had to be laid out to make the water arrive from the main reservoir at exactly the right slant, so that each of the 4 pools received the same amount, like a mother pouring out 4 cups of tea and making sure no one was left thirsty. Think of the stone carver sitting cross-legged on the damp ground, his chisel in his hand, the dust of the stone powdering his knees. He is carving the face of a lion, and he knows that this lion will not simply be a statue to be admired. It will be a pipe, a channel, a voice for the water. The water will pour out of the lion's mouth, and the sick will stand beneath it, and the word of the king will be fulfilled, and the heavens will smile on the kingdom of the Khmer. That is a strange and lovely thing to hold in your head. The sculptor and the plumber were the same person. The sacred and the practical were woven together so tightly that no one could find the seam. And the water, which was both the source of life and the symbol of the divine, flowed through the lion's mouth and was both a bath and a blessing. And I will tell you something else, something I have seen with my own eyes, though the temples were already old when I was young, and the water was already fading. There is a place where the stone lion's head has crumbled, and the channel has clogged, and the water has found its own way around the broken edge, and it falls not through the mouth, but over the cheek, over the calm stone face, in a thin, clear sheet that catches the morning light. And the effect is not ruined. It was not the way the carver intended, but it is beautiful in its own way, a kind of weeping in stone, a softness that no engineer could have planned. The workers are gone, and the carver is gone, and the king is gone, and the water, left to its own devices, has made its own small path down the face of a lion and into the pool below, and the lotuses have grown there, and the frogs sing there at dusk, and it is as if the place has finally finished itself in a way the makers never imagined. So you see, the water system was not a machine. It was a living thing, and like all living things, it grew and it changed, and it mended itself in unexpected ways, and it eventually relaxed into a new shape. The workers knew this. They knew that the water was the true builder, and that their channels were only suggestions, only invitations. They did not fight the water. They listened to it. They watched where it wanted to go, and they helped it get there just a little more quickly, just a little more gently, with less damage and more nourishment. The Great Barre was not a dam against the flow of nature. It was a dance with the flow of nature, a slow, careful waltz that lasted for centuries. And when the music finally stopped, the workers and the kings stepped back, and the water began to dance alone, and the land received it once more, and the circle was complete. We often speak of the collapse of Angkor as if it were tragedy, and in some ways it was. People moved away. The great temples were given back to the jungle. The vines grew over the faces of the gods, and the roots pushed through the roofs of the galleries, and the whole place became a question rather than a city. But the water does not see it that way. The water never saw Angkor as a city. It saw Angkor as a field, a garden, a place where the rain was caught and held and passed around with kindness. When the people left, the water did not mourn. It simply settled back into the low places, and the fish returned, and the water birds returned, and the frogs returned, and the green returned, and the land went to sleep for a very long time in the arms of the wet season, dreaming its own patient dreams. And some nights, if you stand by the banks of the great lake, in the last hour before the moon rises, you can still hear the old sounds if you listen very carefully. Not with your ears, with your skin, with your breath. You can feel the faint rhythm of the tampers, a heartbeat in the earth. You can feel the heavy swing of the baskets, a sigh in the air. You can feel the soft pulse of the water moving through the channels that are no longer there, the way a phantom limb still tingles after it is gone. The workers are not ghosts. They are not haunting the place, but they are present, the way a song is present in a room after the singers have fallen silent, the way a story is present in the dark after the teller has gone to bed. They are present as a residue of effort, a warmth in the soil, a memory in the water. I think that is why we tell these stories, you and I, in the soft hours of the night. We are not trying to bring the workers back. We are not trying to rebuild the channels or refill the barriers. We are simply acknowledging them. We are saying, I know that you were here. I know that you carried the mud and the stone and the water. I know that your back ached and your knees were raw and your hands were cracked, and you did not know that anyone would remember. And in this room at this hour, with the city outside the window grown quiet and the stars turning overhead, we remember. We remember the diggers. We remember the basket carriers. We remember the tamper girls singing as they struck the clay. We remember the gatekeeper with his dry laugh and his oily rag. We remember the cook stirring the evening pot. We remember the children running through the shallows, chasing the minnows and the light. There is nothing more that we need to understand tonight. The water has told us its secret, and the secret is very simple. The secret is that everything is held, and everything is carried, and everything is passed along. The rain is carried by the cloud, and the cloud is carried by the wind, and the wind is carried by the sky, and the sky is carried by the night, and the night is carried by the turning earth, and the earth is carried gently in the palm of some larger hand, which is carried in turn by a love that we do not need to name. The workers of Angkor were part of that great carrying. They did not start it, and they did not finish it, but they held it for a little while, and they held it well. And now, tonight, we hold it too. We hold the story, and the story holds the water, and the water holds the memory of 1,000,000 footsteps, and the footsteps are still warm, and the earth is still soft, and the night is still deep, and you are still here, resting in the quiet. So let the gate stay closed, my friend. Let the water rest. Let the workers sleep. There will be time in other nights to walk the channels again, to visit the smaller reservoirs, to sit with the monks at the edge of the lotus pool, and watch the sun rise over the towers of the Temple Mountain. But tonight, let us simply be still. Let us breathe in the cool, damp air. Let us feel the soft weight of the blanket settling over the day, and the gentle pull of sleep drawing the mind down into the warm, dark dark water of dreams. You have walked far, even here, curled in your chair or stretched out in your bed. You have carried the water in your imagination, and you have carried the memory of the workers, and now you can set it down gently at the edge of the dark and let the current take it and take yourself and drift. The water remembers, the earth remembers, the stones remember, and you who have listened so kindly, you will remember too, not in the sharp way of facts and names, but in the soft way of a dream that stays with you through the morning, fading slowly, leaving a feeling of coolness and calm. That is enough. That is more than enough. The workers would be glad. The king, if he could see you, would bow. And the old woman at the edge of the barre, with the mud on her feet and the laughter in her throat, would nod and smile and say that one understands, that one knows that the water was always a gift, and a gift is only a gift when it is passed along. And so we pass it to you, this old and quiet gift, this story of water and hands and patience and love. Take it into your sleep. Let it carry you gently down, the way the water once carried the reflection of the temple, the way the cloud once carried the rain, the way the night carries us all, without effort, without hurry, without end. Sleep, then, and rest. The barre is calm. The channels are quiet. The sentinel palm stands straight and still against the stars. And the water, the sweet and faithful water, is waiting for you in the deep, soft absence of the dawn.